Okay, so we're going to talk about the brain and the cranial nerves. We're going to start by just going over just the basic parts of the brain, and then at the end we'll talk about the cranial nerves, all right? So basically, some review for you. We had talked about, in general A&P, the cerebrum. This is the cerebrum. That's the largest part. We talked about the cerebellum, which is the second largest part. We talked about the diencephalon, and the diencephalon contained the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And then we also talked about the brainstem. And the brainstem includes the mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And many times we call the mesencephalon the midbrain, right? So we're going to go through the main nuclei and tracts that are in each one of these areas and, what happens. The thing with the brain is that at the lowest area of the brainstem, that's the medulla oblongata, that's the most primitive area of your brain. So that's really controlling just the most basic fundamental functions in your body, right? Which would be what? What's the most basic fundamental thing that keeps you alive? Breathing and your heart, right? Those two things. Now, as we go further up, we get more complicated. And by the time we get into like the hypothalamus and then the cerebrum up in here, that's where it gets even more complicated, and we start talking about emotions and intelligence and just much more complicated thought processes go on in those areas. So we're going to work our way up. We're going to start in the medulla oblongata, then we're going to go to the pons, then we're going to go to the midbrain, then to the diencephalon. We'll take a look at the cerebellum to see how that's functioning, and then the cerebrum. Now I just want to review quickly we have these ventricles. And so the ventricles are these cavities, these open cavities inside the brain. We have the lateral ventricles that are in the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. We have the third ventricle, which surrounds the thalamus or the diencephalon. And then we have the fourth ventricle that's in between the pons and the cerebellum, right? And so what flows inside there? Cerebral spinal fluid, right? So cerebral spinal fluid is produced and it flows through these ventricles, right? And so it's carrying away wastes, it's delivering nutrients, it has ions in it and lots of fluid. So it's just kind of replenishing. I also want to go briefly over the meninges. So there are cranial meninges that surround the brain, just like there were spinal meninges that surrounded the spinal cord, but there's just a little difference with this. When we look at the Pia Mater, we're going to kind of blow this picture up here so you can see what's going on here. The Pia Mater, just like in the spinal cord, the Pia Mater is tightly adhered to the brain, right? So in the spinal cord, it was tightly adhered to the spinal cord. In the brain, there's the Pia Mater tightly adhering to that. And then we have this subarachnoid space, and arachnoid means spider, so you see kind of like a spider web formation going on in there, so that's a subarachnoid space. And then we have the arachnoid mater, right? So then we have this area right here, which is the arachnoid mater, right? Then we have the Dura Mater. There's a space, and then the subdural space, which normally is not there in a healthy person, and then you have the Dura Mater. Now the difference is the Dura Mater around the brain has two layers to it. So there's an inner layer, and then there's an outer layer, right? So here's Here's what we call the meningeal layer. Right there, it's just an inner layer. And then here we have an outer layer that's called endosteal. Endosteal just means bone, but we'll just call it inner and outer. And in between the two, we have a blood vessel there. It's called the Dural Sinus is the space that it's called, and the superior sagittal sinus is the same as the dural sinus. So you might remember that from from general A&P, right? And then we have a blood vessel in there. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that again when we look at the formation of cerebral spinal fluid. So in this area here, this is blood, and then in the space here, the subarachnoid space, this here is cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so there's a thing called the blood-brain barrier, and that's what we're going to go over next. Let's talk about cerebral spinal fluid first. So if we look inside this third ventricle, right in here, this is the third ventricle surrounding the diencephalon. There's a structure in there that's called the choroid plexus, the choroid plexus. So here we see the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. And in that choroid plexus are a lot of cells that are called ependymal cells. And ependymal cells are the cells that produce cerebral spinal fluid. So they're in this choroid plexus, and then we can see that the third ventricle moves down to the fourth ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle moves down into the spinal cord, into that central canal of the spinal cord. And the central canal of the spinal cord is lined by these ependymal cells as well, right? So we have cerebral spinal fluid being produced in the third ventricle, and then also in the spinal cord, and the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow through all these open areas, right? Turn. Doesn't want to turn on me. Guess that's the way it is. All right, so this is the flow. This is what really happens. There's the fluid is going to move from the third ventricle down through the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. And then from the fourth ventricle, it's going to flow into the central canal of the spinal cord. And then it's going to reach the tip, and it's going to come all the way around through that subarachnoid space. So we're going to get lots of fluid flowing around the brain that way. It's going to come up, and it's just going to flow all the way around the brain that way. But in addition to that, when the cerebral spinal fluid gets into the fourth ventricle here, there are a couple of holes in there that are called apertures. And, you know, holes, if you just remember the word aperture means a hole. And the fluid will flow through those holes and into the subarachnoid space that way as well, okay? So both ways, the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow through the ventricles, through the central canal, and it's going to flow all the way around the brain. So the inside and the outside of the brain is going to receive this cerebral spinal fluid. We don't really want a lot of movement of things between the blood and the brain. So there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier, right? There's two different barriers in the brain. The first barrier is called the blood-brain barrier, and that's a barrier between the brain capillaries in here and the neurons. Because you don't want a lot of toxins or drugs from the blood to get into where those neurons are and attack those neurons. We don't want that. So there's this blood-brain barrier. And so the two things that are going to create that barrier are, number one, these endothelial cells of the blood vessel, right? So these are the cells that line the blood vessel. and those are called endothelial cells. So that's number one, what helps to create that blood-brain barrier. And in addition to that, so then we have these other cells in here that are called the astrocytes. And these astrocytes have these little foot petals that are also going to spread out on the outside of that blood vessel, and they create yet another barrier. Oligodendrocytes create myelin. These are the astrocytes. So we have astrocytes and endothelial cells that create this barrier. So very limited things can go through that blood-brain barrier. Like tetracycline can't go through that blood-brain barrier, right? There is a drug, an antibiotic, sulfadiazine, that can cross it, but otherwise, you know, we have to have like a lipid antibiotic to get through that blood-brain barrier, because those endothelial cells that surround that blood vessel have phospholipid bilayer, right? A lot of times what has to happen in the brain in order for you to get medication from the blood into the brain, you have to wait until whatever disorder or disease, like meningitis, right, infection, breaks down that blood-brain barrier enough so that you can actually get medications across to heal and to kill off any of those bacteria. There's also a blood cerebral spinal fluid barrier, because we also wouldn't want anything in the blood getting into the the ventricles. And so the blood CSF barrier is created by the ependymal cells. And like I told you, it's those ependymal cells that produce the cerebral spinal fluid. Well, here they are also creating a barrier so that things from the blood can't get across, right? So they can't get across. So you just want to know the difference. What's creating the blood-brain barrier? What's creating the blood CSF barrier? Since we're going over the meninges, I also want to talk about the dural folds. Dural folds are folds of the Dura Mater that are going to help to anchor down the brain inside the cranial cavity. All right, so there are extensions of the Dura Mater are called dural folds, and these are going to be on your lab list. They're on your lab list, so you have to know them. So the Dura Mater is the outermost, hardest, toughest layer. And if I'm looking at the cerebrum from the back, there's the two cerebral hemispheres. And if we look at that from the back, so the Dura Mater covers the top of it, and the dural fold that comes in a little bit like that and back out again, that fold right there is called the falx cerebri. And what this dural fold does is it just kind of seat belts the cerebral hemispheres down. It acts like a seat belt to hold them down, right? Then we have the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is smaller, but it basically has two hemispheres as well. And so we have this smaller dural fold that fits in between those two, and we call that the falx cerebelli. Again, it seatbelts down that cerebellum, just seatbelts it down. And then finally, we have the last dural fold that is kind of a tent over the top of the cerebellum, and it separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and that is called the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli. So it's kind of like a tent over the top of the cerebellum. Let's start by looking at the brainstem. And so we're going to start by looking at the medulla oblongata. So when we look at this picture here, This down here is the medulla oblongata. So this kind of reddish area, that's the medulla oblongata. And it is continuous with the spinal cord. So they're one and the same, right? They're connected to each other. They're not one and the same. They're just connected to each other, okay? So the nerves that are coming off of the medulla oblongata, those are going to be called cranial nerves. And the nerves coming off of the spinal cord, those are called spinal nerves. So we differentiate them right there. Now we know that there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So the medulla oblongata is going to contain the highest number of cranial nerves. And so cranial nerves, we have cranial nerves 8 through 12 that come off of the medulla oblongata. 9 through 12. 9 through 12. So here you can see, and this is, you just can't see that number very well, but that's supposed to be 9. So 9 through 12 come off of the medulla oblongata. 9 through 12 control the muscles in your pharynx. We're going to go through these individually, so you're going to know what they are at the end. We're going to go through with a chart. But basically, the neck and like the shoulder area. Okay, 9 through 12 are going to control those. So your tongue muscle, your throat muscles, your shoulder muscles, your neck muscles. But we'll go through each one of those individually when we get there. There's some other things, too, that I need you to know about in the medulla oblongata. So I did do some drawings. I'm not wild about my drawings, but I think I'm going to go to them just because I have written down what each one of these things are that we have in the medulla oblongata. We can see, first of all, there's this long thing here that's called the Reticular Formation, this thing right here. It actually is a tract that runs all the way from the medulla oblongata up until we get to that midbrain. So it's going to go up through the pons, up until we get into the midbrain, and we're really going to talk about it more then. But it does have some centers where it controls basic things like posture, breathing, body temperature, sleep. So there's some things that are controlled in there, but for our purposes, I'm not going to ask you what the reticular formation does in the medulla oblongata, all right? You just need to know that's where it starts, and then it's going to go up until it gets to the midbrain. But we do have some other centers here in the medulla oblongata that are very important. We have the cardiovascular center. Okay, the cardiovascular center deals with the heart, and it will increase the heart rate, and it will increase the contractility of the heart. Right? It doesn't set the pace for the heart. What sets the pace for the heart? The SA node, right? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have the cardiovascular center. In addition to that, we have a respiratory center. So there's respiratory centers, and there are cardiovascular centers here. Respiratory centers are, the respiratory center is going to control the rhythm of respiration. Like, what's your rhythm? How many in, how many seconds in, how many seconds out, how many seconds in, how many, okay, so it's going to just kind of control the rhythm. Now it's going to receive input from the pons, but we'll talk about the pons in just a minute. And then the last thing that I want you to know, well, there's two other things really that I'm going to have you know about the medulla oblongata, okay? And then you're going to see these terms down here, the cuneate nucleus and the gracile nucleus. Those are areas that receive sensory information. Okay, so there's the cuneate and the gracilis, or the gracile. They receive sensory information. The sensory information that they receive is like touch. It's going to receive touch, vibration, proprioception. So a lot of general senses, right? It's going to receive a lot of these general senses. And the reason why I want you to know them is because we're going to talk about these tracts in chapter 15 that lead up to those, okay? Now the difference between the two is that the gracile nucleus is receiving information from your lower body, so like your legs and your trunk, whereas the cuneate nucleus is receiving that type of information from your upper body. So when you try to think of ways to memorize this, graceful, she's graceful when she walks, right? So just come up with little ways to memorize these things. All right, so that's our medulla oblongata. There's a couple of other nuclei in there. I'm not going to go through all of those because we've got a lot of other things we have to cover. Right, then we're going to look at the pons, and the pons is right above the medulla oblongata. And again, right away, we can see that reticular formation continues. It's going to go right up through that pons. And the pons has a few things that I want you to know, remember. First of all, it has this apneustic and pneumotaxic centers. These are respiratory centers. We're going to hear about them again when we get to the respiratory system. They adjust what the respiratory center is doing in the medulla. They adjust the medulla. That's their job, to adjust the medulla, the respiratory centers in the medulla. There's also cranial nerves that are coming off of the pons, and we have cranial nerves 5 through 8. Okay, and in addition to that, there are these, there's cerebellar nuclei, and then there are Pontine Fibers. So I want to go back and look at this other slide to show you what's going on there. This is going to be a little bit better here. Okay. So this is basically saying the cerebellum sits right behind the pons, right? So if you remember, when I was talking about the fourth ventricle, I said the fourth ventricle sits right in between the pons and the cerebellum. So this is the pons, and then this back here is the cerebellum, right? So the pons is kind of like a passageway. It's a highway, if you will. And so there are some interconnections between the cerebellum and all the way up to the cerebrum. And there are interconnections from the cerebellum all the way down through the brainstem, or to the medulla. And that has to occur through the pons. It has to go through the pons, right? Bless you. In addition, there are just fibers going from the pons itself back to the cerebellum, and those are called the Pontine Fibers. So we've got the Pontine Fibers that just connect the pons to the cerebellum, and then we have these other tracts which are called Cerebellar Tracts, and they lead from the cerebellum to elsewhere in the brain and the brainstem. Okay? So that's the pons. There we go. Nope. The midbrain is going to sit right above the pons, and the midbrain has an area that's called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. Okay, so this is the midbrain. Corpora means body, quadrigemina. And within the corpora, so if we wanted to talk about like a roof and a floor, the roof of the midbrain is called the tectum, and then the floor is called the tegmentum. And the corpora quadrigemina is in the tectum. And within the corpora quadrigemina are these two nuclei. One is called the superior colliculus, and one is called the inferior colliculus. So these two are, we're still in the brainstem area. These two are related to reflexes. The superior colliculus is going to control a visual reflex, whereas the inferior colliculus is going to control an auditory reflex. Okay. So what do I mean by that? So the superior colliculus, if you see a bright light, you flinch away from it, right? You're going to flinch away from it. That's a reflex. If you hear a loud noise, then the inferior colliculus receives that information, and it's going to cause you to jump. Okay, now let's talk about the tegmentum. So the tegmentum is the floor of the midbrain, and it contains the red nucleus, and it contains the substantia nigra. So I'm just trying to pull things out of the brain that I think are going to be the most applicable. The red nucleus is red. It's actually a very red area that is going to, it has a lot of blood vessels in it. That's what makes it really red. And it controls subconscious motor commands to your upper body. Okay, just to your upper body. Subconscious motor commands. So motor commands that you do with your arm without even thinking about it, right? Just kind of uncomfortable, and you just kind of, you move your hands, you move your arm, right? So it's subconscious control. The substantia nigra meaning black, is a very dark area, and the substantia nigra releases dopamine. Now, we've mentioned dopamine before as a neurotransmitter. Okay? Dopamine, we're going to see, inhibits this other area called the basal nuclei. So we'll talk about how that works when we get to the basal nuclei. So a person that has Parkinson's disease, they are not going to be secreting dopamine in the proper amount that they should be. Okay, the other thing that the midbrain contains that I want you to remember is the reticular activating system. Do you guys remember that from general A&P? What does the reticular activating system do? Keeps you conscious. That's right, it keeps you conscious. So a person that's in a coma, their RAS is not functioning, right? They're not conscious. Also in the midbrain, cranial nerves 3 and 4 exit from the midbrain. What do 3 and 4 do? Do you remember? Oculomotor, trochlear, eyeball movements. We're going to go over those, like I said, at the end. Okay, you guys remember the cerebellum. It sits right behind the pons. It sits right behind the fourth ventricle. If I blow this up and we look inside the cerebellum, we can see that there's a white matter in there that looks like a tree, actually. So that white matter we call the arbor vitae, right? That's just the white matter. And the cerebellum, its function, it has a couple of functions. First thing it does is it adjusts postural muscles. You know, when you're sitting there or when I'm standing here and I'm maintaining a posture, my muscles are constantly contracting and then relaxing. There's some that are contracting, some that are relaxing, but then when I shift, other ones have to contract, other ones have to relax. So we're constantly adjusting those postural muscles all the time. So that's one function of the cerebellum. The second function of the cerebellum is that it refines learned movements. What's a learned movement that you have? Sure, walking, running, riding a bike, any of those things are learned movements, right? They're learned movements. So if we have damage to the cerebellum, a person is going to, they're going to have a wide stance because they're not going to feel like they have the postural ability. They don't have the ability to adjust their posture. So they're going to have this wide stance, and then they're going to be rocking a lot, right? And if you have them walk a straight line, they're not going to be able to do it. Okay, now we're going to go up higher yet, and we're going to look at an area that's called the diencephalon. The diencephalon has 3 areas in it. It has the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So I'm going to go to that first page here that I have on your drawings if you want to draw. And we're looking down here. The diencephalon is made up of, it's above the brainstem, so it's right above that mesencephalon, right above that midbrain, and it has 3 areas to it. One area is called the hypothalamus. Hypo means below the thalamus, hypothalamus. The biggest area is called the thalamus, and we're going to look more closely at that. And then there's an area that's called the epithalamus. Epi means on top of, and it's really not on top of it, but it's kind of right behind it. And it contains a gland called the pineal gland. So let's go over what each one of those things do. Let's start with the epithalamus, which contains the pineal gland. Do you remember what the pineal gland secretes? It secretes melatonin, and what does melatonin do? Yeah, it sets your sleep cycle. So it's released about an hour before you go to bed, and it makes you sleepy. And then the melatonin drops throughout the night, and then eventually you wake up in the morning, right? All right, so that is the epithalamus. Now the thalamus, we always call it the final relay station, but it's just a little bit more complicated than that. It has some other things in it. In general A&P, we just told you it was the final relay station. And what that means is that every single sensory information that you have, whether it's coming in through your cranial nerves or in through your spinal nerves, it has to stop in the thalamus before it goes to your cerebrum, where you become aware of it. Every sensory information, except for what sensation, does not have to stop in the thalamus? Olfactory. The olfactory sensation, the sense of smell, goes straight back to the olfactory cortex. It does not have to stop in the thalamus, but everything else does. The thalamus is really a relay station. That's all it is. It's taking information in, synapsing, and then sending it off. And it has a couple other functions, so we're going to end up talking about those other functions as well, right? So let's look at that thalamus. Okay, so this is showing just where the thalamus is. Now, if we look at it down here, all right, the thalamus is actually divided into like a right and a left. The third ventricle sort of goes right through it and around it. So it's one thalamus, but it's kind of separated into 2 separate lobes, right? So when it's separated out, this is just showing one of them, one side of the thalamus, and there's the anterior group and the medial group, and those pretty much deal with emotions. So there's a very fine border between the thalamus and the limbic system. And so these 2 groups here, the anterior group, they're dealing with emotions, and they're kind of sending information back and forth to the limbic system. They're not back and forth, but they're sending information to the limbic system. They're the relay station to the limbic system. The ventral group down here, this is the group that that pretty much receives all that other sensory information that I was talking about, except for a couple of the special senses. But all that somatic information pain, temperature, vibration, fine touch, crude touch. All of that stuff is going into the ventral group, and then it's going to go up to the cerebrum. Then we have this posterior group, which contains an area that we call the pulvinar. But what I want you to know here is that in the pulvinar, we have these two bodies. One is called the medial geniculate, and the other one is called the lateral geniculate. Okay, so we've got the medial and the lateral geniculate. Now, these areas, I don't want you to confuse them with a colliculi. Okay, these areas are going to receive visual and auditory information. Not like it's not a reflex. So they're just receiving anything that you're seeing that's coming in through your eyes is going to go back to the lateral geniculate. So the lateral geniculate is vision, right? Because I said all sensory information. So what you're seeing goes back to the lateral geniculate, and then it's going to go back to the visual cortex. The medial geniculate, this is your auditory information. That's your auditory information. So anything you hear has to stop in the thalamus first before it goes up to the cortex, and it's going to stop in this medial geniculate. So when we're looking at this picture here, we can see the hypothalamus. The thalamus sits right here. So that round thing right there is the hypothalamus. And then we have that, the third ventricle surrounding it. And then we have this area right beneath it. It's kind of like a, triangular, rectangular, sort of shape. And that is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus has several different nuclei in it, several different centers and areas. And we're going to go over all the functions of the hypothalamus. Okay, so here we go. First thing I'd like to say about the hypothalamus and the pituitary is that there's no blood-brain barrier surrounding this. This is an area of the brain where there's no blood-brain barrier. There's no blood-brain barrier around the pineal gland either, because these areas work on negative feedback a lot. And so the hypothalamus has to monitor what's going on in the blood. It needs to regulate hormonal levels in the blood so that it can determine if it's supposed to be sending out regulatory hormones or not, right? So no blood-brain barrier here. But when we look at this picture, we see, this is the hypothalamus up here, right? And then we have this stalk, which we call the infundibulum. And then right below the infundibulum, we have the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is split up into an anterior and posterior with a little intermediate area right in between there, right? But we want to look at what's going on in the hypothalamus. So first of all, the hypothalamus, it has 7 different functions to it. And so we're going to talk about each one of those. The first thing is that it releases 2 hormones. One is called oxytocin, and the other one is called ADH. So they're released from different areas on the hypothalamus, and they have different functions. So oxytocin, and this is simplistic because oxytocin has some other functions besides this, but we know in the female, oxytocin levels, when she's pregnant and she's going through labor, oxytocin levels raise up, and that causes increased contractions, and it causes her cervix to dilate. Okay. It has some other functions that we know about, like helping a person to, increase their awareness or their focus and things like that. But for our sake, we're going to just say that it is in the female, it causes uterine contractions and basically mammary gland contractions where it ejects the milk, and it causes the contractions of the uterus and the cervix to dilate. Okay. In the male, it has a function too. It's released to help the ducts in the male reproductive tract squeeze and push that sperm along. Okay, so it's a contractor is what it does. Oxytocin is a contractor. It causes things to contract. So think about that. Think about in the breast, if the breast glands, think about them, visually thinking of them contracting, it's going to eject the milk. In the uterus, it contracts and it ejects the baby. Okay. All right, so that's oxytocin. ADH, and we are going to talk about ADH in quite a bit of detail when we get to the urinary system. That's an anti-diuretic hormone, so it causes you to retain water at the kidneys. You retain water. You reabsorb water. When ADH is released, your urine is going to be less volume and more concentrated because you're reabsorbing water. So that's one thing. The next thing is that the hypothalamus controls your body temperature. So this is one reason why it can't have that blood-brain barrier. That blood vessel has to go past the hypothalamus so that your hypothalamus can detect if your blood pressure is high or low. And then it's going to make adjustments based on that. Okay, it also has control center for some autonomic functions. So the autonomic functions, do I have them on here? Autonomic functions are going to be things like we have heart rate. They affect these. Blood pressure, respiration, digestion. Which sounds a lot like your autonomic nervous system, doesn't it? So that is your center for your autonomic nervous system, right? That's where the control center for the autonomic nervous system. And those, the autonomic nervous system kind of works on a daily basis. It's constantly working, adjusting the hormones, adjusting the, I should say the neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about when we get to chapter 16. In addition to that, though, it will stimulate the fight or flight, what we call sympathetic activation. And this is a little, it's kind of different than what I said with the autonomic function, because in autonomic function, one or two glands might be stimulated, right? But in sympathetic activation, all the glands, all of the effectors are going to be stimulated when you have sympathetic activation. So that's a little bit different than just autonomic regulation. Okay, it also controls skeletal muscles subconsciously. So, yeah, I don't know why I don't have this, but subconscious motor function. Especially when you're talking about really strong emotions like rage, pleasure, pain. So what I mean by that is, when you're in a lot of pain and your face goes, ugh, that's a subconscious motor function, right? That happens subconsciously. When a person is sexually aroused and their body writhes, right? That is where that's controlled, in the hypothalamus. Okay, the other thing that happens in here that you need to know about there are these feeding reflexes, licking and swallowing, right? Licking and swallowing. And the last thing is that you have emotions and behavioral drives. Like there's a center that will tell you when you're thirsty. It'll tell you when you're hungry. It'll tell you when you're full. Okay? So those centers are in the hypothalamus as well. All right, so we've got all those things going on in the hypothalamus, and in addition to that, it also releases these inhibitory and releasing hormones that are going to control the anterior pituitary. So there's just a lot going on in the hypothalamus. It's really super important, right? It's a very important area of the brain. The next area of the brain we call the limbic system. So when we look at the limbic system from the front, all this colored area in here, this is all the limbic system. This whole thing. I'll get to that drawing in just a second here. All right, so we've got all of that. If you look at it in just one hemisphere, then it looks more like this. But you can still see all of the colored area. So all of this colored area is part of the limbic system. And if you just look at the limbic system and take out all the rest of it, it looks kind of like, it looks like this. This is what the limbic system looks like, right? It's just all the colored area in there. So part of it is, part of it's part of the cerebral cortex. Like this is a gyrus in the cerebral cortex up here. So part of it is in the cerebral cortex. Part of it we see, as some of it's white matter, some of it's a little gray matter. So we see it just doesn't have a very clear definition of where it's at, right? No clear boundaries, really. And there's only a couple of things I'm going to have you remember about this. First, overall, the limbic system establishes your emotional state. Your emotional state tells you, it's the one that's setting, are you happy today? Are you angry today? Are you tired today? It's setting your emotional state, right? The other thing is that it links your conscious mind with your unconscious reactions, right? Your conscious mind with your unconscious reactions. And then the last thing that it does is it's an area for your memory to be stored and where you can retrieve that memory. So this is the area, say, that you went to prom and you heard this great song at prom and you had all this wonderful, thoughts about prom, and then prom was 10 years ago, right? Every time you hear that song, now it elicits certain reactions and certain emotions within you, right? So it's kind of pulling memory out and then making you have emotions about that, okay? It's also where, like, addictions occur, right? This is where addictions become established because a person has a drug and then it makes them feel good, and then their limbic system says, I want that feeling again, and so then they have more, it takes more drug to make them feel that good again. So this is kind of where addictions are established. But there's a couple of areas that I want you to know about. So first of all, we have this area that's called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is this area down here. And as it's like this biggest, fattest part of what we call the dentate nucleus. And the hippocampus, it resembles a seahorse. It's important in the retrieval, the storage and retrieval of long-term memories, right? So in a person that has dementia or Alzheimer's, this one's usually pretty intact for a long time because they can remember their driver's tests, to get their driver's license. They can remember their kids' names. They can remember these things for a long time. They can remember how to drive for a long time until that area starts to get damaged. Another area that I want you to know about is the amygdala, or the amygdaloid body. And we see that right here. I should have done a different color. Right there. That's the amygdaloid body, or the amygdala. And this one is going to regulate your heart rate during fear and anxiety. So it takes over. All those other areas like the medulla and those other areas where we're talking about increasing heart rate, this one takes over when you're really afraid or really anxious and your heart starts beating really fast. It also helps to control that sympathetic fight or flight response. So like I told you before, there's a real gray line between the hypothalamus and the limbic system. They kind of share, and then the thalamus is sending information to the limbic system. So there's some really unclear areas and some shared responsibilities there. And then also, like I said, it links your emotions with your memories. So certain memories will elicit certain emotions. So now we're going to head into the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is the biggest area of the brain. And we're going to look at the different parts of it. So first of all, one of the confusing things, we know what the lobes are. I know you guys know what the lobes are. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe, right? So we know what all those lobes are. There is, and then we have these sulci. So sulci are deep indentations where gyri are just like really shallow indentations, okay? So we have this one indentation that's called the central sulcus. It's a pretty deep sulcus, and it's very distinct. It's not curvy, it just kind of goes straight down. It's a pretty distinct sulcus that you can see. Anything in front of that sulcus is the frontal lobe. Anything behind it is the parietal lobe until you get down to where the occipital lobe is, right? So it's that central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. In addition to that, we had the lateral sulcus, and the lateral sulcus divides the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. Okay, so when we're looking at the sulcus, we can see that there's a gyrus right in front of the central sulcus and a gyrus right behind the central sulcus. The gyrus right in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus because it's in front of it, so it's the precentral gyrus. That's physically what it is. Functionally, it is the primary motor cortex. And it has a map on it that we call the homunculus. You guys remember the homunculus? It's a distorted body map, right? So it's got the hands and the feet and the legs. So it's a distorted body map. Okay, a motor map, they call it now, I guess, not a homunculus. They call it a motor map. Because if you touch it right where it's mapped out for the nose, then the nose would wiggle. If you touch it right where it's mapped out for the little finger, then the little finger would wiggle, right? So it's mapped out, the motor map. Right behind the central sulcus, we have a gyrus back here that is called the post-central gyrus, right? That makes sense. It's behind the central sulcus, so it's the post-central gyrus. That's what it does. That's its name anatomically. And then functionally, its name is the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, somatosensory cortex, primary somatosensory cortex. This also is mapped out with a distorted map, a somatosensory map, right? I'm not doing it to the way it's supposed to, but it's a distorted map of the body. And so if you feel something on your nose, that information's going to go up to your nose where it's mapped out on there. If you feel it on your little finger, it's going to go, that's where that sensory information is going to. When your sensory information finally gets here to this primary somatosensory cortex, that's when you are aware of what is happening. Up until then, it's really not in your awareness. You're not aware of the sensation, okay? So the sensations that come in here, though, are not the special senses. The sensations that come up into this primary somatosensory cortex are all your general senses. So your pain, your temperature, your vibration, your touch, all of those sensations, all the general sensations end up there. Okay? And the primary motor cortex over here, this is only for voluntary muscle control. So when you voluntarily lift your arm, it's coming from that area. It's voluntary muscle. you might hear in your nursing career or in your careers that the primary motor cortex is also called the pyramidal system because the neurons in there look like little pyramids. So whenever you hear, I don't know if it's on the NCLEX or whatever, if they've taken that off, but the pyramidal system, when you hear that, you just know that that is voluntary muscle movement. It's you're voluntarily moving the muscles. That's the pyramidal system. All right, so let's look in here really quick. I'm going to show you. So the outside here, this is all the cortex. That's the cerebral cortex. And then we can see some white matter in here. This is the corpus callosum that attaches the two cerebral hemispheres together. And then there's some other fibers that connect the hemispheres together. I want to show you that picture next. Okay, so there are some, the white matter then is going to contain myelinated axons. And the myelinated axons are just connecting different areas of the brain together. Sometimes it's connecting lobe to lobe, sometimes it's connecting within one lobe, and sometimes it's connecting the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. So let's look at the different types that we have here of these projection of these fibers. So we're just going to keep this really short here, right? So the fibers that are called arcuate fibers, they're really short, and they're just going to be connecting one area of one lobe to another area in that same lobe. We have longitudinal fibers that are going to connect one lobe to another lobe, right? And then we have the other fibers that are called the commissural fibers, and those are the corpus callosum and the anterior commissure, and those are connecting the right to the left hemisphere, right? Right to the left hemisphere. Deep inside the brain, you know, you've got the gray matter, then the white matter, and then deep to that we have a gray matter again that contains a structure that looks kind of like this. It looks like this, right? And we, so you guys, it used to in our lab exams, you had to be able to identify these, and we've taken a lot of these things out, which is really good. Because the main thing is you need to know what the structure is and what it does. So the main structure in this gray area is called the basal nuclei. Well, yeah, it's the basal nuclei. They used to call it the basal ganglia when I was in school, but ganglia are in the peripheral nervous system, nuclei are in the central nervous system, so basically it's the basal nuclei, okay, basal nucleus. Okay, so the thing that the basal nucleus does is that it helps to, it's subconscious control of your skeletal muscle tone, and it coordinates learned movement patterns. So it sounds a little bit like the cerebellum, right? So it is subconscious control, and it coordinates learned muscle patterns. It doesn't start a subconscious movement. Like, it doesn't start you walking, but once you start walking, it keeps you walking. It has that learned motor, you know, it's like a learned motor pattern. So it releases, it's going to release like acetylcholine. And if it were left alone and it just kept releasing this acetylcholine, it would make your muscles overactive, right? And you would have a tremor because your muscles would be constantly moving, right? But it's inhibited by dopamine. Where was dopamine from? Substantia nigra, right? It's from the substantia nigra. That's where dopamine is from. So dopamine inhibits this basal ganglia so that it takes away all that extra motion and it keeps your motion really smooth. So you'd have tremors, you'd have a really stiff gait, right? You'd shuffle if you didn't have dopamine inhibiting the basal ganglia. So it's important, it doesn't initiate movement, but once movement is underway, it's going to provide the pattern to that movement. And the big thing is that it's inhibited by dopamine. So this is a problem with Parkinson's disease. So we just want to make sure that we have. The thing in Parkinson's is that the substantia nigra is not putting out dopamine. So now you have no dopamine, you have nothing controlling the basal ganglia, or the basal nuclei, sorry, and it just goes crazy and causes all sorts of rigid muscles. It makes your muscles tight and rigid, and then you're, tremoring, just too much contraction. We have to control the contractions in the body with dopamine. Okay, next we're going to look at the cerebral cortex. All right, and I already told you some of the things here. I told you about the general senses. I told you about the primary motor cortex, which is the precentral gyrus. That's primary motor. I talked about the primary somatosensory. That's in the postcentral gyrus. So I've already talked about those two. Now I want to talk about the special senses, because the special senses have to go somewhere, right? They go to the, all of them except for olfactory, go to the thalamus first, and then they go to your cerebral cortex so you can be conscious of what you're sensing, basically. So we have, in the occipital lobe, we have the visual cortex. So where in the thalamus did we say visual information went? Lateral geniculate, right? Then we also have the auditory cortex. And where in the thalamus is that coming from? Medial geniculate, right? Okay, good. All right, we also have, and so once they get to these areas, then all of a sudden you become aware that, oh, you just saw something, or oh, you just heard something, right? So they're helping to make you aware. We also have an area right here in the temporal lobe called the olfactory cortex. So everything you're smelling goes back through the olfactory nerve directly to that olfactory cortex. It does not stop in the thalamus. That's the only one that doesn't stop in the thalamus. Then we have the gustatory cortex, which is in the frontal lobe. So the gustatory cortex is anything that you're tasting. First goes back to that thalamus, and then it's going to go up to that gustatory cortex. So it's important for you to know where these special senses, cortices are. What lobe are they in? Gustatory's in the frontal, olfactory's in the temporal, auditory's in the temporal, visual is in the occipital, somatosensory is in the parietal, primary motor is in the frontal. So just know what lobes they're in, all right? And then know what they're receiving. Now, in addition to those, we have these things that are called the association areas. And the association areas help you to interpret whatever information came in. So we have a couple of different, we have several different sensory association areas, and then we have one motor association area. So let's first look at the sensory association areas, right? So right next to, and they're going to be found right next to these special cortex areas. So here's, again, this is our primary somatosensory cortex. Remember, this is where things like all of your general senses are coming up here. So your touch, vibration, pain, all those general senses are going right up there. And then the association area is right next to it. So this is the association area. So it's called the somatosensory association area, right? Somatosensory association area. This is going to interpret whatever it is that you're touching. It interprets whatever you're touching. Some people that have agnosia, you know, if they had a stroke and now they've damaged that area and they have agnosia, they'll have a really hard time at the sink trying to figure out, you know, like what are they touching? You know, what is that? What are they touching? Then we have another association area back here that's next to the visual association area, visual cortex. So we call this the visual association area. So that's visual association area. And that's going to interpret whatever you see. So it helps you to recognize letters and words. This is where you learn how to read, right? You can be looking at letters, but unless this visual association area is working, you won't even be able to know that a C is a C, and that an A is an A, and that a T is a T, and that they spell cat. Your ability to read is developed here. If you have damage to that area, you'll see symbols, but it'll mean nothing. Just symbols. You just see something, but you have no idea what it says. Then we have an auditory association area right here. The auditory association area is it is going to, again, interpret what you hear. So it helps you to recognize words, right? You recognize words. If a person has damage to this area, then they're going to be able to speak, but it's going to sound like nonsense. They're going to come up with words that just don't even make sense. I hat tomorrow for sunshine. You know, so the words come out clearly, but nothing ties together, nothing makes sense. They can't find the right words when they're speaking if there's damage to that area. Okay, so those are our association areas for sensory. Then we have a motor association area, and if you remember that gyrus right in front of the central sulcus, that precentral gyrus, we said was the primary motor cortex. That's up here is not a 10, it's a 1 with a little prime. So that's a primary motor cortex. And the association area is right in front of that. Okay, it's right in front of that. And this is, it stores learned patterns of movements. It stores your learned movements. It stores it. It's your muscle memory. You know, we always talk about muscle memory. So when you're learning to juggle, it's really hard at first, and pretty soon it's pretty easy, right? You learn to play the piano. It's kind of tough at first, but then after a while it becomes pretty easy. It's because this association area, this primary motor, it's not primary motor, it's the motor association area, helps to store that information, store that pattern of movement. Okay, so those are the association areas. They interpret, all of them interpret what is going on in those primary areas. Okay. Then we have the integrative areas. And the integrative areas are, they're usually lateralized to one cerebral hemisphere. So like in the right or the left, but not in both. And there's only a few of them that I want you to know about. So we have, first of all, the general interpretive area right here. You can see that it's kind of in the parietal lobe, goes a little bit into the temporal lobe. It used to be called Wernicke's, but I'm sure, you know, we wanted to get rid of the person that found it. So it used to be called Wernicke's, but now we just call it the general interpretive area. It's only in the left hemisphere. And it helps to comprehend language. That's one of the things that it does. So anyway, let me tell you, these integrative centers, they're receiving information from the association areas. So they receive information about whatever you're interpreting that you heard or see or feel, and they're receiving all that information from those interpretive areas, or those association areas. And then they have to come up with a motor response. So they bring in that information, and then they try to coordinate a motor response. That's basically what these integrative areas are doing. So, for instance, Wernicke's area is going to receive information from your visual and auditory association areas. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're hearing, and it will develop a response. So I said this in general A&P. For those of you that weren't in my general A&P, I'll tell the story again. There was a book out there called A Man That Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and he was a great musician, and then as he got older, he started to have some problems with his brain, and his friend was a great psychiatrist and a neurologist, psychiatrist kind of combined, and brought him into his office. And this man just couldn't. He heard what his friend was telling him, but he couldn't, and he knew what he had to do, but he couldn't get his body to do the command correct. So at the end of the visit, the doctor would say, okay, you can go ahead and put on your hat and you and your wife could leave. And so he would reach over to grab his wife and try to put her on his head because he was getting the information, but then this integrative area, this interpretive area, wouldn't allow him to come up with the right motor command to do it, right? So there was a disconnect between what he was comprehending and what he was trying to do, okay? So that's why it's the general interpretive, because of that. It's a disconnect. Then we have the speech area here, and the speech area used to be called Brokaw's area, so you might still hear it as that. Brokaw's area is the one that is your motor speech area. It's your speech area that helps you to produce speech. Again, it's only in the left hemisphere. And so if there's damage to that area, the message still goes down to your muscles in your throat, and so you can make sounds, but you can't make words come out. And so a person will grunt, So they grunt, right? So that's different than the Auditory Association area where we said they can say words because there's nothing wrong with Brokaw's center, but their words don't make sense. So there's a difference between those two. Right, so that's Brokaw's area. And then finally we have the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex right here, that is one that it does a couple of things. It helps you to plan. It helps you to predict consequences. It helps you to reason. It helps you to judge. And this is what we tell people that's not fully developed until a person is 25 years of age. Right? 25 years of age. It's one of the reasons why we have the, like the drinking age is 21, right? It wants that prefrontal cortex to be more developed before we let people make their own decisions and reason as to whether they should be drinking or how much they should be drinking, right? So there's that. There's also, if there's damage to this prefrontal cortex, a person just becomes really flat, just real flat, like no emotion, no nothing. If it's damaged, they can't answer questions like, tell me how long ago that happened. When did that happen? They can't reason or judge when was that? When did that happen? Okay. A lot of times they still do these things too. If a person is if there's a criminal or if there's a person that has super high anxiety, like to the effect where they cannot do any of their activities of daily living, they will still do the electric shock therapy. They don't call it that anymore, but electrical shock, where they'll shock that and try to bring them out of that funk, right? They're trying to shock those so that a person can predict, reason, judge, plan, and they can at least do their activities of daily living. Criminals, when they get super violent, they'll do that too. And they still do a prefrontal lobotomy too, where they'll take a section out, and again, that person becomes real flat. Very severe cases, though, not often done. Okay. right? There's lateralization, so there's, you know, your right side of your brain is a little bit different than your left side of the brain. And, you know, we don't have to go into that too far in depth. The right hemisphere is good for math, writing, spatial relationships. So you don't have to know the difference between the two, but you do need to know that Wernicke's, Brokaw's area, those are both in the left hemisphere. You should know that. But math, writing, spatial relationships, those are in the right hemisphere. So, all right, that's it. I did have something on about an EEG, and that's just where they're, you know, that's something I'm not even going to put on the test, but that's where they're just looking at your brain waves to see if they're normal or not. Okay, that's it.